Our guiding principle at ASA, American Safe Aerospace, is that we don't have enough information to make conclusions, nor do I even have a framework necessarily to make a conclusion about the progeny of some of these. I mean, some of the cases are just so spectacular. I can't imagine in any scenario that it would be a technology by someone, a blue country, a red country, an industry player, anything like that. But I don't know where to go from there. There's two parts of the conversation here. So there's this disclosure process that we've heard about. What does the government know? What are they going to tell us? It's a bit of a fool's errand, in my opinion, because no one is ever going to be satisfied with what the government releases, and they'll never be in a position to release everything they have anyways. So there's always going to be discontent and disillusionment with that process. The other side of the coin is the process of discovery. What can be done in the public using commercial tools outside the scope and limitations of the classification system in the military to bring answers in this space. And I think the disclosure process motivates the public to engage in this to new levels, which has effect of then further pressuring the government in order to disclose more information about what they know. And we get this, this positive effect of growth in this area. So from our perspective, we're focused on the discovery process. What information can we bring to light in the public to motivate Congress, executive branch, academic community, scientists, and others, industry, in order to pursue this. And I think through that process, both discovery process and disclosure process is going to drive us towards the truth.
Ryan Graves, you are a former U.S. Navy pilot. What was your path to becoming a fighter pilot?
Yeah, hey Brad, thanks for having me on. Unlike a lot of, I think, people in that position who had this childhood dream of flying those beasts, I had my, revelation after my junior year of college during an internship when I realized that the career path I had set myself up on wasn't going to be quite as exciting as perhaps I had hoped. And so I made the decision right then and there within a day to change my major to aerospace engineering and put everything I could into trying to go fly fighters in the military. Finished out my senior year, applied to Officer Candidate School, was accepted as a pilot, and that started about 3.5 years of training.
You said made a change within a day. Was there a special moment?
Yeah, there particularly was. I was doing a fire protection engineering degree. It was a dual bachelor's master's program. And as one might imagine with fire protection engineering, while there's the science and the math of it, but there's also the regulation and code with it. And he dropped a very large book on my desk during an internship that, thudded quite literally and metaphorically in my life. And they said, hey, might as well start studying. This is going to be the rest of your career. And literally, quite literally in that moment, I was like, nope. Not a great motivation for a young, motivated person to get into a career. So that was the very moment I quit later that day and drove home from the internship the next day. And basically schemed my way into a pilot slot in the Navy during the drive home from Atlanta back to Massachusetts.
Wow. And so you do great through the training. You make it through the fighter pipeline and everything. You become an F-18 pilot. What's a day in the life like when you're preparing for deployment, workups, that kind of thing?
Gosh, yeah. Workups, preparing for deployment workups is perhaps even worse than what I'm about to describe, but even just the daily, squadron life before we do workups, and of course deployments, is quite intense. And, you go through all those 3 to 3.5 years or so of training to get in that cockpit, and you think you know a lot. You don't realize how much there is to learn, but even after those 3.5 years, you've just got the very, very basics of how to operate and employ an aircraft and a weapon like that. So when you get into the fleet, you begin level 2, level 3, level 4 training, we call it. And this takes you from, a combat capable wingman to a combat section lead where you're leading another aircraft into all sorts of combat, up to a division lead where you're leading 3 other aircraft into combat. And there's some specialized training in there as well. Forward air controller airborne, where you're employing multiple aircraft as weapons, taking command of the battle space, landing signal officer, where you're there to help and qualify people to land on the boat, and rescue mission commander, where you're perhaps leading the entire air wing in to go rescue a downed pilot in a combat scenario. All of this is training that I got to undergo before we even got ready for deployment. And that's the life. So, you might have a 5 a.m. flight or a 10 p.m. flight, depending on the schedule, and you're fitting in probably about 2 to 3 hours of preparation for that flight just to get ready. Another hour and a half brief. That's very regimented and very precise. And then you get your perhaps hour to hour and a half flight. You come back, and depending on the flight, you might debrief for 5 to 6 hours or more. And then you might have to refly that flight if you didn't do it well enough.
Mm.
And so it's a very um, strict and powerful process, that takes you from, I think I'm a F-18 pilot, to I can go operate, in any combat scenario I happen to find myself in, which is unique to being in the Navy. We have to operate in all combat environments as an expeditionary group. We can't call in specific fighters or specific bombers. We have to do it all.
Yeah.
So it's all day, it's every day, and when you get ready for workups and deployment, that turns into somehow even more all day and all night, while also perhaps living aboard the aircraft carrier to execute these ops throughout the day and night.
Yeah. I really want people to understand just how busy you can be in that phase as we get more into your topic and UAPs and things like that, because to miss that is to miss some of the challenge of getting over the hump of sort of reporting things, doing things that are unconventional, going against any sort of grain when you're just so busy. And that's often the way it seems to be in the Navy.
No, absolutely. And so, when we have this thing that no one really wants to touch, it's very easy to ignore, right?
Mhm.
And when you operate in that environment in a fleet squadron, very much your reputation, your ability to operate effectively is based off of people's trust in you,
Yeah.
your trust and your reliableness under pressure. And so to constantly identify something that people might seem as, off the wall or outlandish, it's not the position you would want to be in. There's really no incentive. My argument, and maybe we're skipping ahead here a little bit, is that, it's worth to have the conversation. It's worth having that pain, because what we could be seeing could represent a real national security risk or aviation safety risk, regardless whether, it turns out to be aliens or whether it turns out to be China.
Hmm. Yeah, and you talk about the reputation. One of the first things that I learned in the Navy was something like stay in the middle of the pack, because if you stick out too far forward or too far back, people start getting in trouble. And that was sort of a conformity lesson that seemed to be pushed on. So to step out of that, there's a culture against that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thankful to report that, since I've spoken out and over the past 8 years or so, the culture has undergone a major shift. And
Great.
this is a topic that is regularly talked about and briefed to, amongst, current naval aviators. I've spoken with them directly on this. And just to jump back a minute, as we said, there's this real risk that's going on acknowledged, and we're so busy. This didn't even make the official debriefs, right? We weren't coming back and
Mm.
incorporating this into this. All right, what any of our administrative issues that we had on the flight? Oh yeah, I saw, UAP, or there was traffic. What it would actually sound like is, there were multiple unknown, air vehicles in our working space, and we chose to ignore them and operate around them so we conduct our mission, right? You'd think that that would be like a red or yellow flag that would be talked about in debrief, but it wasn't. It wasn't
Mhm.
until we kind of got back to the ready room or to the Joper room, and talking with your fellow junior officers and be like, okay, so what the f was that all about?
Yeah.
And trying to figure it out on the down low.
Yeah. So let's get into we're saying this a little bit. What were some of the strange things that you saw?
Yeah, well, this all started when we came back from our first deployment. So when I finished training, I finished what's called Priority Alpha, which meant I qualified to top and was able to get sent to a forward deployed squadron immediately. So after I finished my training, about 3 weeks later, I flew my first operational mission in the Middle East. We did that for about 5 or 6 months, and then we steamed back. And when we came back, we entered what's known as like a maintenance phase, where we're doing some work we put off on the deployment. We're upgrading some of the systems in our jets, and one of the systems we upgraded was our radar, which provided this upgrade provided us significant increases in detection capabilities. And as soon as we started flying with those jets, we were detecting unknown objects in our working areas. Our working areas consist of, many hundreds of square miles off the coast of Virginia Beach, starting about 10 miles off the coast. And as we'd launch and our radar would be looking into the area, we'd start to detect, these various objects, from surface level up to, 30,000 feet and above. Um, they were behaving in ways we wouldn't expect. Some of them were completely stationary. Some of them were supersonic, 1.1, 1.2 Mach. Others were in a circular or racetrack pattern, zero point 0.6 to zero point 0.8 Mach, about 250, 350 knots or so. It's like, what the heck is going on here? The first assumption was new radar, new system, new software. Potentially these are glitches. These are clouds we're picking up or radar reflections. And this type of radar architecture wasn't supposed to have those types of issues, but, that's the obvious answer here. Eventually, however, we started to correlate these detections across multiple sensors on our aircraft, EW systems, the FLIR, missile systems, and eventually our own eyeballs. But before we had that, before we had the visual sighting, we had all this additional radar, sensor data telling us that, yes, this is a physical object. And we had to make the assumption at that point that they were. And so that led us to try to gain that visual sighting. We would find one that was stationary. We'd step down below it. We'd slow down. We'd lock all our sensors on it. All that information would be pumped into our visor in like an augmented reality system. So as we're approaching it, we'd look out and literally there'd be a box in our visor telling us where to look, right, as we come to this merge. And although we're very accustomed to doing this at 1,200 knots of closure, somehow with 180, 200 knots of closure, we couldn't visually ID these objects. We couldn't pick them out. We couldn't see them. We turned back around and we'd reacquire them on all our sensors. We didn't really know what to do with that, but that was the state of affairs up until about a week or two later when two aircraft from my squadron were heading out to the working areas. And right at the very entrance to the working area, specific altitude and GPS location, as they were crossing that threshold, one of these objects went right between the two jets, about 50 feet from the lead cockpit, about 100 feet from the other aircraft, and was visually spotted by the lead aircraft. He canceled his flight at that point, returned home, had a look of shock on his face in the ready room with all his gear on, and just looked at us and was like, I almost hit one of those fucking things.
Yeah.
We all knew what he was talking about. We didn't have a name for him really at that point, but next question is, what did it look like? He just said it was a dark gray or a black cube inside of a clear sphere. No propellers, no propulsion. And yeah, that was it. About 5 to 15 feet in diameter is what he estimated. And when we had that incident, it was a moment for us in the squadron where it's like, all right, this is, like a documentable safety issue that we have to report. And so we went through that process. The safety officer started learning that this was more common than perhaps we had known. And as it turned out, there were 4 other near misses that went unreported in the previous months. And so we filed HAZREPs for all of those, backdated some of them, and off they went. And they're publicly searchable now because they've been accessed by the Freedom of Information Act. So those can be found on Google.
And for those who don't know, a HAZREP is?
Oh yeah, HAZREP is a hazard report. It's basically a near miss, something that could develop into, an actual mishap.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of goes out to the fleet, and everyone else can kind of see, like, hey, these people are having this issue. Be cautious. That's kind of it.
So that's where the first sighting is. And you said it was 2 aircraft. Were they each single seat?
Both were dual seat.
Dual seat. So 4 people see this. 4 human beings.
Well, only the lead aircrafts are, which doesn't surprise me because the secondary aircraft is like laser focused flying formation, right? Or the guy in the back seat's head down doing something.
Yeah.
But the front pilot's scanning and all this, and so they clearly saw it in the front seat.
Okay.
Or the first aircraft.
Okay. And then is that the end of it?
Yeah, because they cancel their flight. They're not confident in their radar. They were rebooting their radar during that process. because it had issues. So they were kind of blind out there. But all of a sudden, it's like, hey, now we have these things that are at the entrance of our areas. I don't trust my
Yeah.
radar. We got to get back.
Yeah.
Um, and when you have a malfunctioning aircraft and then you have a near hazard or near mishap because of it, canceling the flight, coming back, and addressing the issues, the right call.
Hmm. So you start making HAZREPs about this, realize that it's been going on for a while, and then does it keep happening? Is it over? What happens next?
It keeps happening. It keeps happening. We essentially make the decision as a squadron to just avoid them, right? No
Hmm.
more investigations. If they're in an area, we'll go to a different area. And that was really the state of the affairs for like the next year and a half. We continue to see these objects out there. We would just work around them and go about our mission.
Wow. Okay.
Um, we left in the 2015 time period to start a workup cycle off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida, getting ready for our deployment. And when we got down there, the objects either followed us down or were already down there. Same issues. In fact, we had dozens of incidences, as I later learned, that the strike group admiral was aware of and later emailed commands about. But on one particular flight, an aircraft from my squadron, two very good friends of mine in the cockpit, detected various objects within 50 miles of the carrier and went to investigate. Those videos, were shown to me in classified spaces in the ship after the flight. And years later, in 2017, some of those videos were released in the New York Times article that came out, particularly the Go Fast in the Gimbal video. And so those were two of dozens of cases. And I later learned through Admiral Tim Gallaudet, who later ran NOAA, that he received an email from the strike group admiral saying exactly that they had had dozens of instances. They were preparing to cancel the training event, the entire workup cycle, because of how many incidents they were having. If anyone was doing any technology test or anything, that they had to immediately stop. And so this wasn't just one or two instances. This was dozens of incidents that we had, as we were engaged on that workup cycle.
So there's this volume of events. There is this risk. I mean, getting within 50 miles of the carrier, major threat, and yet there are reasons not to go public with this too. What do you think were some reasons not to go public with it right away?
Well, I was not in the mindset that this was a public problem yet.
Hmm.
I expected that this would get resolved through whatever mechanism it was. We weren't using the term UAP. Of course, there were some jokes about UFOs, but we really were kind of in a blank slate and not really being overly sharing about speculation, I'll say. I think generally everyone was saying, hey, like this is probably an adversary and there needs to be some investigation into this before we have a mishap with someone that's spying on us. But, it was business as usual. We continued the work and eventually we left for deployment
Hmm.
to the Middle East. There are reports that I've received from folks on that deployment, not at the time, but later, that have had issues with very similar objects in the Red Sea and elsewhere on the transit. E2 pilots and fighter guys alike, visually IDing, silver spheres and whatnot, while conducting operations. But for me, I only got a little bit of this deployment. My time was up, and I shipped back to become a flight instructor back in Meridian, Mississippi. And for me, I just kind of forgot about this and assumed it would be resolved. And a couple of years go by, and I'm sitting on my couch when that New York Times article comes out. Massive moment of deja vu is I'm listening to my friend, one of which who was in my wedding party, their voices in the New York Times talking about these mysterious objects that we saw. And that's, I just kind of took stock at that point. I'm like, I called some of my friends that were still out on the East Coast. I was like, are you guys still having these issues? And they're like, yeah, we're business as usual. They're still out here. The only fix that has been done is that they filed a notice to airmen, which is called a NOTAM. It's basically a bulletin of issues around an airport. The lights are out, taxiways closed, airspace is being used for a test. In this case, they just had a daily NOTAM that, hey, unknown, air vehicles operating in the working areas to use caution. So literally the smallest Band-Aid one might imagine for a potential national security risk was the mitigation that was put into place.
Yeah.
And this was my moment where I said, hey, I'm not operational anymore. I have a little bit more time. I'm less under pressure. Perhaps now I could do something to try to help resolve this for, the guys and gals that are still flying out there, so they can focus on doing their jobs. And my way of doing that was simply to reach out to the people that published a New York Times article, that released the videos, and just let them know that, I was there when that was taken. I watched it in the skiff. I can provide you some context around the event. Of course, I won't share anything classified, but if that's helpful, then I can do that. And that's kind of what started the snowball, if you will. Within a few months, I was in D.C. speaking to the Senate Armed Service Committee and Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, as well as a group within the Pentagon, and sharing much what I just told you.
Mm-hmm.
And not just myself, but other squadron mates and folks in other squadrons that were having the same issues also spoke under the condition of anonymity, to validate my concerns that I had raised. And that was kind of the impetus that led to the conversation that we're having today.
Yeah. And Ryan used the term UAP versus UFO. What's the distinction there? How did that come about?
Yeah, so UAP is a term, I think it was first introduced maybe even in the 60s. A lot of people think it's a relatively newer term, but it's really catched on more since 2017 and a little bit earlier. And, and I think it's frankly the right move. One, it's a more accurate term, although a bit more nebulous, right? Unidentified anomalous phenomenon. But it also doesn't restrict the definition to anything in the air or anything that's flying, right? So when asking for UFO information from the Space Force, they might say we don't operate in the atmosphere. We don't fly anything. And I know that's not technically true, but generally speaking, they say it's not our domain, right? Not our problem. But right, if you have a more inclusive term that includes things that are less well defined, then you can't get those kind of BS answers from agencies as they try to stonewall you. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect is that the term UFO is more than just a collection of the individual words that make it up, right? It's a cultural phenomenon. It has so much baggage and context around it that is associated with fantasy and imagination, and the line between fact and fiction, well, it's certainly blurred, but mostly towards the side, of fiction. But it's hard to engage in academia and elsewhere where you have that baggage coming with the term. And so I think appropriately, the name change has helped people to digest and integrate that information without immediately turning off to it. And I don't say that softly or lightly. It's truly, a mental block, if you will, where you see the term and immediately you'll dismiss everything that follows, right? And it's not even like a conscious decision. It's just a cultural upbringing, if you will. And even just, mitigating that alone has, I think, opened the playing field for so many more people to get involved.
Yes. Yeah. And Ryan, one thing I wonder about too is, at first this wasn't reported, and then there's the backdating of the HAZREPs, and then it's sort of growing, and then it gets to the New York Times. What did your training say to do about this, or was it outside of what you'd been trained to?
Yeah, it's a good question. In some ways, it was outside of our training. In some ways, it was in. It was in our training as a safety issue,
Hmm.
right? And that's how we treated it. We don't really have the training to deal with novel threats that might be red air while operating within the United States, right? So we're an expeditionary force. When we go somewhere, we're going there to kill stuff and blow stuff up on the other side of the world. It's less about are we being probed, or are we being evaluated. That's more National Guard, Air Force, intelligence, counterintelligence, NSA type stuff. So no, I frankly no, we're not really well trained on that. And we didn't know what to do with it, who to report it to, but we did pass it up our chain. In addition to submitting a report, we also, of course, passed it up to our commanding officer, who I at least know passed it up the chain from there and presumably continued up. And so one would expect that risk had been identified and the proper mechanisms in the counterintelligence world may have been stood up to help resolve this. And from our perspective, absolutely nothing was happening.
Hmm.
and nothing was happening up until the point when I made a decision to speak about it publicly.
Yeah.
Uh, I have learned since then that there was a secretive program, a secret program, I should say, uh, within the Pentagon that did receive these reports.
Okay.
And at the time, that organization was known as the UAP Task Force.
Hmm.
And we didn't receive comms from them, and I'm very supportive of the work they've done. I've learned a lot about it. But that was kind of the organization that later morphed into what's going on now with Aero. Not to say they're similar in their um, approach to this topic, for better or worse, but it's part of the lineage of organizations that started, back then and even earlier, in some cases.
And that new organization you said is Aero?
Yeah, so the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, housed within the Pentagon, it was created through congressional mandate in order to, um, well, theoretically, to investigate this issue and bring that data forward to Congress. However, their name is Resolution Office, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, practically speaking, their goal is to resolve as many of these in the most efficient manner possible.
Yeah. One thing that I wonder about with the training is we talked a little bit about language, human nature, and then your training kind of all playing together to deter people from talking about this, maybe. And something that you and I had talked about on the phone before we had this conversation is that when I was on the teaching training side of things, we would talk about a visual illusion called autokinesis. And the way that, when you teach a Navy brief or something, you have this standard curriculum and you're told to kind of present it with a story. And so the way that we would present the story before teaching this illusion was like, imagine somebody thinks that they saw a UFO. And, you're out flying at night and you see this point of light dancing in the sky. So we would immediately invalidate the idea that you could see something that behaved as what you call beyond the state of the art, like being at a hover in high winds it just doesn't seem to make sense. And could I bore you with some of the details of my notes on
Please.
autokinesis? So I dug up some of my old notes from years ago. Autokinesis is the illusion that a stationary single point light source is moving. This occurs due to involuntary, called saccadic, eye movements. The eye is constantly making small involuntary shifts under normal circumstances, such as multiple visual cues. The brain is able to counter the saccadic eye movements, and they are not noticed. In situations where there is a single point, there are no other references in the visual field, so the brain tends to interpret the relative movement of the point across the retina as an actual movement of the light source. So your eye moves a little bit, but when there's only one light source, it looks like the light source dances.
Mhm. And what that
Makes
looks like in reality for a pilot is you hear stories of people, especially early on in their training, going to join on a fighter, an aircraft at night, right, visually. So you're identifying the aircraft, and people, there's always a story of folks that try to join on a star, right,
yes,
because they think it's their lead, and they spend all this time trying to join on them. And yeah.
yeah. So I wonder about if we present that with a story where we immediately disregard UFOs, and we make it sound like somebody'd be crazy to think it's that, and then you see something that behaves in a way that maybe your mind culturally associates with a UFO, and now we call it UAP. Just what impact you think that has on people? Do they doubt themselves? Do they doubt their professional abilities? Do they question their mind? Does it disturb their view of reality?
I don't think it does. I think what it does is it cuts off your office as a viable resource to help deal with that issue, right? Because I
Mm,
think the pilots themselves will be confident in what they see,
hmm.
but they realize that it's going to potentially be dismissed if they bring such concerns, or it might be seen as a medical issue, which would then therefore be a risk not worth even mentioning.
Yeah, yeah. There's that whole culture of and I mean, I was on flight status too. You don't want to go bed down. You don't want people to think that there's anything to be suspicious about. So there's that too.
And
That's
you probably have a whole podcast just on that topic, right? And how
yeah,
that's ultimately not beneficial for the individuals or the Navy itself.
yeah. So in general, anything else that you think makes aircrew reluctant to report things like this?
Um, I think I think there's been a lot of cultural change, and that wave is progressing, but it's not all there. I think one of the major issues that is an easy fix, but kind of goes to the core of what maybe is a bigger problem here, is the fact that this isn't a two-way conversation or an easy process for these pilots to undergo. So if they most of them don't even know there's an official reporting mechanism. They haven't been trained. It hasn't been incorporated into their training, which is something I advocate for as part of the aviation process to, at least have some context around what they, should do, or to just at least be aware that this is in the realm of possible instead of dealing with this kind of shock of what they might be seeing. Um, and of course, as technology in space grows, there's going to be an increase in optical illusions and distractions in the atmosphere, and those have to be accounted for in pilot training, or else, people are going to be constantly distracted. So, I've had witnesses come to me and say, "What do I do with this?" Right, and I've had
Mm,
to point them to very obscure instruction that's buried on CIPRNet, on the classified network, that tells them precisely how to submit through a very arduous process this data to the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or ARROW. And then once they do that, the general feedback from the witnesses I've sent there haven't been positive. Typically, the cases are dismissed at first glance. The witnesses don't feel like the information is being recorded properly, or that the conversation is being taken seriously. And that's if they get to the point of having that conversation. Typically, they just file a report and they hear nothing back. Right. And so obviously pilots, we have maintenance reports to file. We have, the tapes and the debriefs. And I just told you about this 14-hour day. Why are we going to take the time to submit some report if we don't even know if it's landing in the right inbox, if we're not getting any feedback, even if folks are really interested in knowing what these are and helping to fix it, which it seems like they are. It just becomes, another task that, doesn't seem to be moving anything forward. So there really needs to be a cohesive effort of educating across branches the proper procedures and providing continuous education about why it's important. And, I think it's strategically irresponsible for us not to incorporate this. And, to your point of, the optical illusion effects and briefing as UAP, let's imagine a world where we had empirical, indisputable proof that we were the only intelligent beings in the universe, right? Just indisputable. When I say universe, I say broadly, multiverse, anything you can imagine. If we had that indisputable proof, would we still be interested in what we're seeing? Yes, because it
yeah.
might be an adversary, it might be something that isn't incorporated into our knowledge as some kind of, phenomenological effect, or something we just don't understand yet. So the fact that because we don't have the empirical proof, we have a harder time grasping and fitting this into our understanding of the world. It's a very interesting problem in that way.
Yeah. And Ryan, you mentioned that it's got to be a two-way dialogue. So we've talked about a lot of the barriers to reporting it. What are some of the barriers to reception?
Well, I don't think there are barriers to reception. I think there's barriers to transmission back, right? So
Mm,
whether it's lack of resources and manning, whether they don't have anything to really share back, information regardless is just not coming back. And, this could very easily be a roadshow where they're going to individual squadrons or to safety stand downs across the country, briefing this topic, briefing their reporting procedures. And I guarantee that would be the most interesting part of that brief.
yeah.
And people would be very interested. But that work's not going on. That's, some low hanging fruit.
Hmm. Have squadrons contacted you for anything like that?
hmm I've even been contacted by the Naval Aviation Safety School to
Yeah.
help them prepare training on this.
Yeah. How's that going?
So, I mean, that goes to the point, right? Like the Navy itself and the offices that are established to help support this are not are failing in that responsibility to a degree where the Navy has to reach out to volunteer organizations to help collate and understand this information.
Mhm. Yeah. How has that gone? Have you had a chance to connect further with any of them?
We receive so many reports within our organization, and over the past couple of years, we've taken those reports. Well, let me back up a little bit. So, I had these experiences, and and I got out of the Navy in 2019, and continue to engage on this topic, kind of culminating in 2023, where I testified before Congress on this issue. And a little bit before that, I started Americans for Safe Aerospace, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. And our goal was to motivate and educate Congress, with the tools of DC as an organization. But we just started receiving hundreds of reports from folks like myself, veterans, and just regular people. And in some sense, we weaponized those reports, right? We brought to the Senate Armed Service Committee, members in Congress and the Senate, House and the Senate, and different organizations such as the FBI,
Mm,
and early on, we were bringing the arrow until, we received dissatisfactory results of those interviews and began bringing those witness cases to the FBI, who's really grown their involvement in this investigation in a big way. And so, those reports and those ammunition, those reports have been our ammunition to kind of affect this change, a lot of, and motivate people across these organizations to say, hey, okay, yes, this is a risk, this is a problem, um, and we need to identify ways to remedy this. Um, and so, for us, we continue at safeaerospace.org to receive reports. And, one of the calls I would put out to your listeners is that, one of the most effective ways that you can make a difference in this conversation now is that if you see something, report it. Almost every day we talk to witnesses who tell us that, they thought they're the only ones that ever seen something like this, that they've kept it a secret for 10 years. And often we hear they're just thankful that there's an organization that might be able to do something useful with this information because, they've been spending the better part of their life wondering what these experiences meant.
Yeah. Yeah, again, the human nature element of this is big, right? If you think you're the only one and you don't want to appear as weird, or sometimes there can be this sort of, you feel like there are many people doing it, and so why should I bother? Kind of a bystander effect or a
Mm-hmm.
diffusion of responsibility. So it seems that clarity of procedure is really important to people. That's something that I've seen in the language of some of the legal documents that have come forward that you've been working on with the House and things like that. What is it about reporting and procedure that you're working on?
So, first off, I think there needs to be a standardized reporting mechanism and framework, both from a data schema perspective as well as a known place where this information can be entered. We're filling the gap and we're taking reports because people trust us. But for the aviation community, I think there's some very viable areas that could be modified to accept these reports, such as the aviation safety reporting system. My organization helped advise on legislation that's been named the Safe Aerospace for Americans Act. It was introduced by Congressman Garcia and Grothman. And that legislation would require the FAA and NASA to modify the aviation safety reporting system to handle these types of reports. It would also require NASA to undergo an education campaign for commercial pilots to educate them on the usage importance of such a system. And it also protects pilots from professional retribution from their employers for talking publicly about this. Nearly every commercial pilot we talk to says, I don't want to be talking about this publicly until I retire or I'm no longer under the thumb of my employer. And that's not how safety improves. That's not how we resolve issues like this, by being afraid to talk to them because our employers might fire us, right? There's rules and regulations against that, and this legislation would allow existing whistleblower protection laws to apply this type of reporting as well.
Mm-hmm. For people who do fear things like that, what's the experience been like for you as someone who's reported it?
Well, for me, I was at a transitional point in my career where I
Mm-hmm.
was going to be stepping away from the Navy anyway. So I had the opportunity to burn bridges in a way that perhaps others couldn't. And I don't feel like I really did burn a bridge. I was also taking a risk and stepping out on a ledge.
Mm-hmm.
I often work with the government on the defense contracting side, on the research and development side. So, as far as the big eyes of the government, I don't think I've ruffled too many feathers and still maintain a security clearance.
Okay. And flying was not something you weren't concerned about, hooking up with the airlines or anything like that after.
I put myself on a path to be able to get a job like that. It was never really my passion to fly a big wing aircraft around the country for the next 20 or 30 years after flying fighters. I know I talked dismissively of it, but there's kind of that contrast, and I made the decision ultimately that I'd be okay not doing that and finding my path in areas where I was more passionate.
Hmm. So now you're in this work on UAP at large. How many of these things have been documented?
Well, gosh, if you want to be as holistic as possible, we can probably make an estimate of close to six, seven, 800,000, in entirety. And I couldn't point you to a single database, but accumulation of efforts across the decades. But our organization is nowhere near those numbers. We've been receiving reports just from people that email us and later that submitted on the form on our website. And unlike others, we talk to most all of our witnesses. We schedule
Yeah.
a follow-up call and we
Wow.
get into the details of the case. And honestly, that's where the gold is, right? Those are where the details end up falling out that otherwise don't get captured on a form. Um, and so we have about 850 reports and growing right now that we collected over the past 2 years. Um, and of course, there's a quality spread in there. But we have about 50 or 60 reports that are extremely compelling from highly credible witnesses, with corroborating data, not often in our hands, but existing in classified spaces or other locations. Um, I almost consider them David Fravor level quality cases, if you will, with the Tic Tac, where it's hard to impinge on his reputation and those that corroborate his account. Um, those exist, and like I said, we've been using those as ammunition to motivate representatives and organizations in order to pay attention to this. And we think the time is right to start sharing those reports more broadly with the public now. We've set in motion events at various agencies and organizations that I think are going to be beneficial to this conversation. And now I think it's time to motivate the public with the same information. And so we're going to be sharing those reports publicly on our website, safeaerospace.org, and to our members who sign up to our mailing list. And having conversations with those witnesses. Ask me anything. Bring them in for conversations. We're creating small visual shorts of some of those experiences so that we can put the viewer in it. So it's not just a narrative on a page, but they can kind of really feel the weirdness of why these reports are so special. And so, that's something that we're implementing now, and we'll start sharing those reports soon. And in fact, one of our witnesses is probably be coming forward before this airs. In about a week and a half, who's also been helping us with our report intake, and his story is quite compelling.
Okay. Can you give us a hint? Anything, or is that one's got to wait until the big
I'll give
moment?
you a little hint. Sure, a group of intelligence officers spotting a highly exotic object over a very sensitive military base within the United States. Very large, multifaceted object with articulating panels that essentially disappeared before their eyes.
Okay. Watch out for that. So Ryan, 850 reports with your organization, and you use a phrase to describe the people who are making these reports. It's something like credible people seeing things beyond the state of the art. What is that? Language seems so important with this issue.
Yeah. So one, we receive reports from everyone, right? Of course, we don't discount reports because someone, is not an aerospace engineer. It's just the value in those reports might come in an aggregation of data and the patterns that are detected versus any one individual report. But perhaps when you do have a trained observer that's operating sophisticated equipment and things of that nature, perhaps as part of a group, then of course that, report holds, a lot of value and a lot of weight. And so, as we look through those cases, we're looking to prioritize cases that have anomalous characteristics that are identifiable, whether that be through video evidence or even just through the narrative of the report, right? Um, and what does anomalous mean, right? And generally, the way I think about it is that it's beyond the state of the art, and beyond state of the art, might look like if we started building this now, it's unlikely we would have it in 10 years, 10 to 15 years, right? Um, so that's kind of a general principle, and sometimes that comes in the form of kinematic behaviors that might be observed, right? The object accelerated extremely rapidly, it changed direction very rapidly, deaccelerated rapidly. It could be for advanced signal management, so perhaps and some of these are capabilities that we can employ within our military. Some are perhaps more advanced and beyond our capabilities. For example, we can mask RF signals, right? Perhaps we don't even transmit them so people can't track a drone. Perhaps we shield the propellers on a UAV so that they don't create as much radar scatter, so that they're not detectable. Maybe they use passive sensors so they're not transmitting, right? These are things we can do, we can engineer around, and they manage the signal coming off, the holistic signal coming off that craft. But then you start talking about, well, what about these reports of, visual signal management, right? Essentially cloaking technology, or, combining all of these into an incredibly small package, or having infrared masking, which seems like just another thing, but, that's just heat energy that you're getting to the bottom barrel of physics. And it's very hard to control and rechannel at high heat. So there's almost always an IR signature, but often these are untrackable in IR devices. So all these kind of, are different areas where an object could be anomalous. And of course, the kinematic ones are the most exciting, right? If you see something just totally shoot across the sky, it's hard to dismiss that. But some require a little more sophistication in making that determination. And of course, then there's like points of origin, right? And time on station. If these things are launching from the ocean, flying out of it, and then flying 10 miles over the coast and then hanging out for 2 hours and then flying back while remaining undetected, well, all that is an advanced capability that, I don't think we have.
Yeah. So within these reports of these capabilities and things, what trends, patterns do you see coming up that get your attention?
There's a lot of activity in orbit.
Yeah.
I'll say that. Or at very high altitudes, or what's considered very low Earth orbit, that kind of in between space, right, where there's atmosphere and orbital speed, perhaps. You know, there's a very large increase in observations of, and it's not Starlink. People are very adept, at least pilots are, at identifying Starlink, especially the satellite flares that go in and out kind of from different angles and look like things are maneuvering when they're not quite. It's another thing to see things that are like rotating in space, like orbiting in space, right? That means it's well, let me be more careful with my words. It's not orbiting in space, but like seemingly holding over a fixed position, orbiting at extremely high altitudes, or what appear to be apparent dogfight between sources of lights, again at 100, 150,000 feet perhaps, um, over the same piece of sky, right, for 45 minutes, an hour. So there's a lot of activity like that going on at very high altitudes that pilots are reporting across the country, including things that seem to drop down from orbit as well before engaging in these behaviors. Is that advanced technology? Is that something else? I don't have the answer for it. Um, Another trend is aircraft following. Commercial airliners have had, dozens of reports, the aircraft being either trailed on the side and sometimes in the front of air vehicles, typically lights operating as a group, right? So you might have like a red, orange, and green light kind of interplaying and moving around within some, perceived volume. And then that just volume kind of moving around the aircraft at times, moving to the right wing, moving to the left wing, moving in front of the aircraft at close ranges, and then doing so for an hour, hour and a half, before either climbing out of sight or descending down towards the ocean. And they're bright enough to illuminate the ocean ground, or the surface of the ocean, as these aircraft are, at 30,000 feet. And they're actually starting their descent when these things typically disengage. So, just kind of an interesting data point. And that's happening at various locations around the world, and in some places more often than the others. Very consistent trend with black triangles, typically described very similarly, slightly isosceles triangle, right, where one of the sides is slightly shorter than the other. About 150 yards per side. Blue lights in the corners of the craft, with typically a darker blue or purple light, sometimes red in the middle. Multiple reports of those coming within 500 feet of fully loaded commercial airliners. One near miss in one location. Both pilots saw it. Fully loaded 737, complete nose on nose pass 500 feet with this object. Both clear as day, could see it. No indications on TCAS, no radar indications, no turbulence from the pass either. They were so perplexed by what they saw that one of the pilots drug tested himself after the flight.
Mm.
He's like, he's going down the logical train of what could have, possibly caused this. And so when I talk about introducing this to pilots in training, it's not about trying to socialize ET or anything else. It's giving them some kind of framework and context to be able to ingest these experiences without having to resort to drug testing themselves to see if they were sane during their flight.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's the problem. That's the safety issue. Like we're
Yeah.
not arming these pilots with what's needed in order to safely operate their aircraft. And that's not just one case. I can think of two others off the top of my head, some at 5,000 feet, some at 30,000 feet in different parts of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what I was trying to get at a little bit earlier too when we were talking about training is just, to be in a position where this can make you doubt yourself so much that you wonder if maybe you've been drugged or something. It just seems unfortunate. Ryan, what do you think is going on with all this?
Oh, that question, huh?
Yeah.
Well, our guiding principle at ASA, American Safe Aerospace, is that we don't have enough information to make conclusions, nor do I even have a framework necessarily to make a conclusion about the progeny of some of these. I mean, some of the cases are just so spectacular. I
Mhm.
can't imagine in any scenario that it would be a technology by someone, a blue country, a red country, an industry player, anything like that, right? But I don't know where to go from there, right? I don't have the framework to then make a conclusion. It just opens up more questions. And I think the way that we do get enough data to make those conclusions is exactly that, right? Bring in more data, more reports, use that to motivate Congress and the executive branch in order to release what they know. And, I see there's two parts of the conversation here. So there's this disclosure process that we've heard about. What does the government know? What are they going to tell us? It's a bit of a fool's errand in my opinion, because no one is ever going to be satisfied with what the government releases, and they'll never be in a position to release everything they have anyways. And so there's always going to be discontent and disillusionment with that process. The other side of the coin is the process of discovery. What can be done in the public using commercial tools outside the scope and limitations of the classification system in the military to bring answers in this space. And I think the disclosure process motivates the public to engage in this to new levels, which has an effect of then further pressuring the government in order to disclose more information about what they know. And we get this, this positive effect of growth in this area. So from our perspective, we're focused on the discovery process. What information can we bring to light in the public to motivate Congress, the executive branch, academic community, scientists, and others, industry, in order to pursue this. And I think through that process, both discovery process and disclosure process is going to drive us towards the truth.
Mhm. So Ryan, we have a lot of unknowns, right? We don't know exactly what's going on, and it seems hard to even imagine an answer. And then we aren't having a total catastrophe, right? There isn't some class alpha mishap with something like that happening. So unfortunately, sometimes that can be the motivating factors when there's disaster, loss of life, things like that. So without any of that, what do you do to sort of make the argument clearly important still?
Yeah, and it's a bit of a catch-22, right? When I was a trained safety officer, went to the aviation safety school, mishap investigator, and had the unfortunate opportunity to employ those skills on multiple Class A mishaps. And I think there's just one nuance here is that when you're doing a safety and a mishap investigation, you are looking very tangibly to identify what those root causes were and to prevent it from happening again. And just by its nature, a UAP, an unidentified anomalous phenomenon, or if we even want to use the term UFO, there's no, I think, logical or sane mishap investigator that would include a term as nebulous as that as a causal factor in a mishap, right? It's
Mm,
something that I think for the industry writ large doesn't exist. So there's no safety report you would see logically that would include that term, because it would be an open-ended mishap investigation, right? The causal factor is an unknown object, right? Like it's like great, well we can say that for anything and just save a bunch of work, right?
yeah.
So it's not productive, I don't think. So I think when you kind of say, okay, well, there's been no mishaps, I think that might be a little disingenuous. And I'm not saying that I have clear evidence of that, but I
Mm,
think it's more than just looking at past records and seeing what's popped up. There are a lot of anecdotal stories, going back to the 50s and others of, strange occurrences that ended with the loss of aircraft. But were you to look at the particular, safety investigation, if you're able to access it, it's not going to say caused by UFO or caused by UAP. It's going to say, pilots out of contact and, resulted in a mishap, potential pilot confusion or something, right? So I think, that's kind of part of this, is that this has been totally left out of the conversation and has just not been a factor. So it's hard to look back and say it hasn't been an issue. It hasn't been a documented issue. I will grant that. So, if, looking forward, how do we make that more tangible? And I think the best way to frame this isn't necessarily that, we're afraid that one of these objects is going to ram itself into an aircraft, although there are some very close calls that have essentially been exactly that. But how is the pilot responding to this, right? You can imagine a scenario where there's a black triangle going over your head and the pilot just dumps the stick, as a reaction and breaks a flight attendant's neck on the ceiling, right? So I can see many circumstances where either pilot, inadvertent response to the vehicle or the event, or distraction during a critical phase of flight. Numerous events of Tic Tacs and other objects being sighted at 2,000 feet on busy approach corridors, with two-way traffic kind of in a pattern, right, with these things just trawling down the middle of the pattern, people calling in approach to it and just screwing up the whole flight operations, right? Those are where the mishaps are going to happen. But are you going to see that documented if that mishap occurs, or are you going to just hear that it was pilot distraction?
Mm. Yeah, that's tricky.
So it is tricky. I don't have the right answer for you, but I think ultimately the best answer is what we're doing, which is to identify these cases that have these aviation safety, risks that are documentable, and share them publicly, and share them with pilots and educate them and let them know that these are real risks that their colleagues have experienced, and do its grassroots. If NASA is not going to get involved and the government is not going to get involved, we'll provide that help directly.
Hmm. Ryan, another thing about this too is things like the location. I mean, you talk about your squadron being right off the coast of Virginia Beach. That means you're near Norfolk, biggest Navy base in the world. So many targets. It seems tremendous risk there. What about this proximity to these military locations?
Well, that's a very big issue, and the areas that we're working off the coast of Virginia Beach, like you said, right there by NAS Oceana, where we fly out of, to the north, just several miles is um, uh, Norfolk Naval Station, the largest military base in the world, naval base in the world. You go further north, you have Langley Air Force Base, which has been in the news for multiple UAP incursions over multiple years. You have DC right there, and of course, further north, New Jersey, and all this other activity we had a couple years ago. So, you look at my event in isolation, you look at New Jersey in isolation, or Langley in isolation, it's one thing. But when you start to kind of realize that this is a trend that maybe started in 2013 or earlier and has been all over this part of the country, it's much more alarming when you consider the capabilities, assets that we have there. Langley houses the, rapid response air teams for DC, right? And so that was taken offline. And you have numerous reports of these objects operating over DC proper as well. And these events have occurred for several years in a row, and I think it's going to be interesting to see if that happens again this fall. It's been during a very specific, like 5 to 8 week window each
Mm,
fall for the past 3 years or so.
mm. What do you think is going on there?
I don't know, but ultimately the response should be the same.
Hmm.
Treat it as a potential national security threat and an adversarial intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance mission, ISR mission, and respond appropriately.
Yeah.
But we seem not to be doing that. We seem to be stuck in this position where, because it's not an ICBM or a MiG, we don't, our policies, procedures, legislation, instructions across DoD, FAA, local state police, FBI are not designed in order to accommodate this type of threat. And I think we identified that last year, and legislation has been moving forward to make that easier to respond, both for base commanders and for local police forces. Um, and I'm expecting legislation in the future that's going to open up the spigot quite a bit to enable these individual, components with law enforcement to be able to react to these types of systems more effectively in the future.
Ryan, it seems that there's ambiguity around so many of these issues, and it might be hard to sink your teeth into it. But when we look at it in total, all these different angles that we've talked about, you start to see the weight of it all. For you, we've started to talk about what you're doing to address this, but let's get specific on that. What are you doing about this issue? What is your scope of work now?
Yeah, great question. We've talked a little bit about it at Americans for Safe Aerospace. We have a number of lines of work, of effort, um, that's really just charged around our mission of identifying what's in our skies.
Hmm.
And part of that goes to reducing stigma and bringing in more allies into this conversation. Um, and as I mentioned, we do that with our reports. We take our reports, we screen them. We speak with the witnesses. We put them in the briefing documents. We present those across DC, both in Congress and various agencies within the executive branch. Ones that have potential national security concerns or aviation safety risks. We often refer to the FBI, who, with the witness's permission, will investigate that case in order to help resolve the issues that it might represent. And like I said, we're getting ready to share those reports more broadly with the public, and that's going to come with, if you will, an education campaign about, why these reports are important and how people can affect change in this conversation. We're going to be at a lot of aviation events in 2026, from Oshkosh and Sun and Fun and different industry events, talking one-on-one with pilots, having events, and hearing directly from the horse's mouth about what issues they're dealing with now and incorporating them as allies into our work. Our goal, in short, is just bring forward the most compelling reports that we can and use that to change the conversation, the state of affairs around this topic.
Yeah. Are you welcome at the fun stuff? Do they let you in at Tailhook and things like that?
Oh yeah, I've been to Tail a bunch. Last time I was there, it was great because I got again to hear from the horse's mouth directly
Yeah.
from guys that are
Yeah.
still flying around these objects and incorporating them into their briefs. And yeah, we'll be at Tailhook next year as well.
Great. Great. What do you think you do to prevent adverse consequences for people who do report?
I think you change the national conversation,
Hmm.
right? And that's I think the most effective thing you can do is reduce the stigma and make this a conversation that people are comfortable having, right? And that will percolate down into the ready room and provide the motivation for people to actually care and actually go through the pain of reporting this, right, with the systems that exist now so that we can make progress. And ultimately, and that's not the solution for every problem, but in this area, stigma has been such an impediment to progress and bringing people into the conversation. And it's you could talk all day, I think, about why that is and how we got to this place and was that intentional or not. But regardless, it's the world that we're living in. It's the world that we're changing right now.
Yeah. What what recommendations would you have for commercial airlines? We've talked a lot about this from the military side.
Yeah. So, commercial airliners are a unique spot. I mean, I know pilots that have seen very odd things on their routes consistently over months. There's some pilots I've spoken to over the course of years who have, been filling me in on patterns of what they've been seeing. I think the biggest thing that, commercial pilots can do is to report them, not just report once that you've been seeing stuff regularly, but report every instance, right? And that's the type of data that's going to allow us to build these trends and patterns and influence change legislatively because we have those solid examples of why there's a problem. I would also encourage pilots to speak to their union about this issue
Hmm.
and see what they're doing to perhaps implement tracking of these objects. I don't think that's going to come from, these airlines management. I think, the unions have responsibility for the pilots and their safety. And so I think they have a very unique role in being able to support pilots in reporting this. And we're happy to help them, devise what those reporting systems look like.
Yeah. Yeah, Ryan, so much of this is about data. What do you think can be done to best aggregate the data?
So there's a few processes in place, I think, and I think unfortunately some of them are set to fail. For example, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, um, you know, there's been talk of them ingesting the aviation safety data, right? That might otherwise go to the aviation safety reporting system. As a quick reminder, the aviation safety reporting system, the reports that go through there are publicly available and they can be used for safety briefs and update pilots. If Aero was to ingest those reports, they would immediately become classified, right? And so we can also see the problem to the safety aspect here. If pilots are making safety reports and those are being classified and not shared with the rest of the community. So I don't think a centralized classified system is the right answer. Um, I could go into a spiel about how the reduction of stigma is probably the right answer generally
Yeah.
in this area. But ultimately, it's, I think you have to motivate certain groups in different ways. So I think there is a room for a general public reporting, but, doing that is a lot different than appealing specifically to pilots or aviation professionals because there's different standards, different types of reports, and different ways that they might be affected if they have, negative pushback from their employers. So I don't think there's one answer to say, hey, here's the way that you collect the data the best way. I think there's probably multiple answers, but I think those reports need to be put into a standard format that can be used across these different groups in order to do that centralized analysis, right? And I think there's, it's probably a long conversation, but I have a vision for a more cohesive whole of government approach to this. Aero currently builds itself as a whole of government approach. They only have, Title 10 authorities. They're a DoD organization. There's limit to what they can do, in civilian grounds, for example, or who they can coordinate with. They're not. So, I think a whole of government approach really looks like a whole of government. You have different agencies such as the National Science Foundation involved. You have the DOE involved, its compute resources and their, familiarity with going after esoteric scientific theories. You have, of course, the FBI and other law enforcement agencies as part of this, one of these report collection areas. And then you open up that data and that topic through perhaps the National Science Foundation, allow people to apply to do work on that, right? You expand the scope of it into the public so that we can get all these innovative people into the problem. First, just scoping it down to a group of 5 people in the DoD. So we really need to activate our industry, our innovation ecosystems, our startup ecosystems, our academic ecosystems to get access to this data. And I think that's the right direction.
Mm-hmm. And Ryan, before we did this conversation too, you opened my eyes to some legislative efforts. What do you think can be done on the legislative side?
Yeah, well, there's the Safe Aerospace for Americans Act, and that's legislation that we advised on, and I briefly mentioned it before, providing those protections for pilots, providing them a trusted place to report, and education on how to do so. That's part of that discovery, side of the conversation. There's also legislation afoot at the moment, known as the UAP Disclosure Act. That is, of course, more on the disclosure side of things. And of course, there's overlap in that Venn diagram of things that we care about and things that are happening on the disclosure front as far as transparency to this wider mission. And so I would encourage people to look up the UAP Disclosure Act. It's been introduced by some of the leading Democratic and Republican senators, and should be moving to the House as part of the process here, where it died last year. So there has been some change in members on various committees, and I think the optimism is higher than it was last year that legislation could get through. But that would be critical legislation because it would create a panel that would have the responsibility of declassifying information as it pertains to the UAP topic, which would obviously help our investigations with what pilots are seeing.
Yeah. What can people do to get behind that, Ryan?
Best thing I would recommend is to join us at safeaerospace.org. We ask for your zip code because we can then talk to your representative and let them know how many people in their district care about this issue. And we're going to have numerous ways where people can actively support this legislation and our activities that we'll be communicating through them on our email list.
Nice. And Ryan, before we get to our last topic, anywhere else people should look for you online?
Yeah, you can also find me on X at Uncertain Vector. I'm often posting there and talk about this topic and our experiences. And of course, safeaerospace.org.
Awesome. Well, Ryan, last topic. We've talked about the stigma and things, but what do you think that government organizations agree with you on?
I think the people in those government organizations agree with me a lot on, the national security implications, the aviation safety implications, and perhaps most importantly, the opportunities that this conversation could afford us, both in technological investment and in understanding our world. And so I think the friction comes with the organizations themselves, right? The structure with which they exist, right? But I'm motivated by the fact that, like I said, these people are very motivated, that there's often this bottoms up groundswelling of interest, whether it be the FBI, National Science Foundation, Congress in some cases, and elsewhere, where it's not the organization that's changing, it's the people in the organization, right? Their perspectives are changing and they're pushing their organization to change, to catch up. And I think that's been extremely effective, and I think we'll see more fruits from that in the near future.
Nice. And Ryan, just before we wrap, for anybody who's in this space, this industry, what else would you say to them regarding this stigma that might encourage them or be worth considering?
It's, water is not that bad, you know? I think the fear of the stigma is much worse than being out and open on this topic.
Hmm.
So it's like a lot of things in life. The fear of it is much worse than the reality. So jump in, be the weird guy in the conversation. I think you'll find that a lot more people have these types of experiences than you might think, a lot more. And you'll have some pretty interesting conversations.
Yeah. Well, Ryan Graves, for having this conversation with me, for being that kind of person, thank you so much.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having it, Brad.